the royal court had never been so silent. Beneath towering marble columns, hundreds of nobles stood shoulder to shoulder while soldiers lined the walls with polished spears. At the center of the chamber, Duke Lucien Ashcroft, the feared Iron Duke whose victories had protected the kingdom for years, stood in chains before the judges. Across the room, Lady Elara Ashcroft clutched the silver railing that separated the spectators from the accused. Her heart pounded with frightened hope because she believed her husband would speak the truth, defend his honor, and silence every lie that had stained his name. Instead, Lucien slowly lifted his eyes to meet hers. For one endless heartbeat, the warmth she had always found there seemed to return. Then his expression hardened like winter stone. "I never loved her," he declared. Gasps echoed through the court. Before Elara could breathe, he pulled the wedding ring from his finger and let it strike the marble floor with a sharp metallic sound. The ring rolled toward the judges, while the world around her dissolved into whispers and cruel smiles. Her knees buckled, darkness closed around her vision, and the memory of how everything had begun flooded back with merciless clarity. Years earlier, Elara Wynthorne had lived in a crumbling manor owned by distant relatives who considered her little more than unpaid help. Orphaned before she could remember her parents' faces, she spent each dawn carrying water, scrubbing floors, polishing silver, and preparing meals she was rarely allowed to eat herself. Her cousins wore elegant gowns while she stitched torn sleeves by candlelight and slept beneath a leaking roof in the attic. Yet hardship never hardened her heart. Whenever she received a slice of fresh bread, she quietly divided it among hungry children waiting beyond the estate gates. When elderly neighbors struggled through winter, she delivered firewood without asking for thanks. She possessed no fortune, title, or influence, but kindness seemed to follow her wherever she walked. One autumn afternoon, as leaves drifted across the stable yard, Elara heard an angry shout. A wealthy nobleman was striking a young stable boy for accidentally frightening a valuable horse. The terrified child raised his arms to shield himself, but Elara stepped between them without hesitation. The whip cracked across her shoulder instead. Pain flashed through her body, yet she refused to move aside. She looked directly at the furious nobleman and calmly said the boy deserved mercy, not punishment. Hidden beside the courtyard entrance, Lucien Ashcroft witnessed the entire confrontation. He expected fear from a servant girl confronting power, yet all he saw was quiet courage. He ordered the nobleman to leave, helped the injured boy to his feet, and thanked Elara for protecting someone who could never repay her. Their paths crossed again and again over the following months. Lucien visited the village under the excuse of inspecting roads, though his real reasons slowly became obvious to himself. He found Elara reading borrowed books beneath an old oak tree, delivering soup to widows, and teaching poor children their letters with charcoal on broken boards. She never treated him differently because of his title. Instead, she challenged his opinions, questioned unfair laws, and spoke of a kingdom where every child deserved opportunity rather than privilege. Lucien discovered that beneath her gentle voice lived remarkable wisdom, while Elara realized the stern duke carried hidden compassion beneath his intimidating reputation. Their conversations lengthened from minutes into hours, and friendship quietly blossomed into love. When Lucien announced his intention to marry Elara, outrage swept through noble society. Powerful families accused him of disgracing ancient bloodlines for an insignificant orphan. His cousin, Marchioness Celine Varick, smiled politely in public while secretly promising to destroy the woman she considered unworthy of the Ashcroft name. Lucien ignored every protest. During a simple but beautiful ceremony, he vowed before the kingdom that honor meant nothing without kindness, and Elara promised never to forget the ordinary people whose struggles had shaped her life. Although applause filled the cathedral, many smiles concealed resentment. Marriage brought happiness but not acceptance. Palace servants loyal to Celine deliberately ruined Elara's gowns before royal banquets, served cold meals after everyone else had finished dining, whispered insults whenever she entered a room, and once locked her outside during a fierce snowstorm until Lucien found her shivering beneath the palace archway. Every cruelty wounded him almost as deeply as it wounded her. Each evening he wrapped warm blankets around her shoulders, read poetry beside the fireplace, danced with her in deserted halls, and listened as she described dreams of building schools, hospitals, and safe homes for forgotten children. Those quiet hours convinced Elara she had finally found the family she had searched for since childhood. Then the king died without warning, forged evidence accused Lucien of treason, and the trial that would destroy their lives began. The sentence Lucien had spoken echoed through Elara's mind long after the courtroom emptied. She remembered neither the guards pulling her away nor the nobles whispering with satisfied smiles as the Iron Duke was led toward the royal prison. She remembered only the sound of his wedding ring striking the marble floor, as though every promise they had ever made had shattered beside it. Before sunset, the royal council stripped her of every title, every possession, and every privilege. Servants who had once bowed before her avoided meeting her eyes as they packed a single bundle of plain clothing. No one offered comfort. No one questioned the verdict. To the kingdom, she was no longer a duchess but the discarded wife of a traitor. Her carriage rolled through the palace gates beneath a cold gray sky. Crowds gathered along the road, eager to witness her humiliation. Some shouted that she had shared her husband's crimes, while others laughed at the woman who had dared believe an orphan belonged among the nobility. Rotten vegetables struck the carriage walls, and several nobles spat into the muddy street as it passed. Children, repeating the cruel words they had heard from their parents, threw handfuls of dirt at the wheels and called her a liar. Elara lowered her eyes, not from shame for herself, but because she could not understand how kindness had disappeared so quickly from hearts she had once hoped to change. The driver abandoned her at the edge of the capital before nightfall. Without another word, he turned the carriage around and disappeared into the rain. Elara stood alone beside the empty road with only a small bundle pressed against her chest. The autumn storm soon soaked her thin dress, an icy wind cut through the fabric until her hands trembled uncontrollably. Every inn refused to offer shelter after recognizing her face. Every door closed before she could finish asking for help. Exhausted and nearly frozen, she wandered through narrow streets until a familiar voice quietly called her name from a nearby alley. Old Martha stepped from the shadows holding a lantern beneath her worn cloak. The elderly servant had cared for Elara since her first days in the palace, offering gentle advice whenever the younger woman felt overwhelmed. Martha had ignored the council's orders and secretly followed the abandoned duchess through the city. She led Elara to a modest cottage on the outskirts, where a crackling fire pushed back the bitter cold. Though the house contained little more than 2 chairs, a small table, and a narrow bed, Martha insisted Elara take the only mattress while she slept beside the hearth. She sold a silver locket that had belonged to her late husband to buy bread, blankets, and medicine without mentioning the sacrifice until Elara discovered the empty ribbon around her neck. Days became weeks, yet bitterness never found a home inside Elara's heart. Instead of dwelling on her own suffering, she noticed neighbors weakened by a spreading fever. She spent long hours cleaning wounds, boiling herbs, and comforting frightened families despite lacking proper supplies herself. When medicines became too expensive, she removed the jeweled necklace Lucien had given her on their wedding day and sold it to purchase enough remedies for the sick. Watching strangers recover brought quiet satisfaction, even as the last valuable reminder of happier times disappeared forever. Martha often wondered how someone who had lost everything could continue giving so much, but Elara answered only that pain understood pain better than privilege ever could. One stormy evening, while returning from a church where she had helped prepare meals for the poor, Elara heard the faint cry of an infant carried by the wind. She followed the sound until she found a wicker basket resting beside the church steps. Inside lay a tiny baby wrapped in damp blankets, his face pale from the cold. No note revealed his parents, and no one nearby claimed him. Without hesitation, Elara lifted the child into her arms and wrapped him beneath her own cloak. Martha welcomed the baby into their cottage despite knowing they barely possessed enough food for themselves. They named him Oliver, and for the first time since leaving the palace, Elara felt hope flicker within her wounded heart. Far beyond the capital, thick stone walls surrounded the kingdom's most feared prison. Shackled within a narrow cell, Lucien endured endless questioning while pretending every accusation had broken his spirit. The guards believed silence meant defeat, but each night Captain Rowan Hale found discreet ways to pass messages through a loyal jailer who still trusted his commander. Rowan reported that Lord Cedric Blackwell had quietly placed hired killers throughout the kingdom, waiting for any opportunity to eliminate Elara if Lucien publicly defended their marriage. Every cruel word spoken during the trial had been chosen to convince those hidden enemies that she meant nothing to him. Lucien read each message beside the dim prison lantern, knowing the woman he loved now believed the lie completely. When Rowan's final note confirmed that Elara had survived and disappeared beyond the reach of Cedric's spies, Lucien closed his eyes, whispered a silent prayer for her happiness, and accepted that protecting her meant allowing her to hate him, unaware that far darker storms were already gathering beyond the prison walls ahead. 5 years passed, carrying away the whispers that had once followed Elara through every street, yet they could not erase the quiet determination growing inside her heart. The abandoned cottage where Martha had sheltered her slowly became the center of a thriving village built through compassion instead of wealth. Farmers donated unused land after Elara helped their families survive illness, craftsmen volunteered their skills to repair broken buildings, and widows found purpose teaching younger women trades that could support their households. The small church expanded into a school where children learned to read regardless of birth, while an old warehouse became a bakery whose ovens never stopped feeding the hungry. A modest clinic welcomed the sick without demanding payment, and neglected gardens burst into colorful blossoms that reminded weary visitors life could return even after the harshest winters. Travelers began calling the settlement Havenbrook, though most remembered it simply because one remarkable woman lived there. No one outside the village recognized Lady Elara Wynthorne as the disgraced Duchess of Ashcroft. Time had softened the sorrow in her eyes but not the kindness that had always defined her. She wore simple dresses, worked beside laborers, and refused every attempt to place her above the people she served. Children ran toward her each morning with laughter instead of fear, while Oliver, now a lively 5-year-old boy with bright curiosity, followed closely behind carrying baskets of fresh bread for elderly neighbors. Martha watched them with quiet pride, believing the child had healed wounds that no medicine ever could. Although Elara still carried memories of Lucien, she buried them beneath endless work, convincing herself that the happiest chapter of her life belonged forever to the past. The kingdom knew nothing of the sanctuary's founder, yet stories about the mysterious Lady of Light spread across distant provinces. Merchants spoke of a woman who accepted strangers without asking their names, soldiers described a refuge where wounded veterans received care without judgment, and poor families traveled for days hoping to begin new lives within the welcoming village. Elara insisted every newcomer contribute according to ability rather than status, believing dignity grew through shared purpose instead of charity alone. Her example inspired generosity in others, transforming ordinary people into neighbors who willingly carried one another through hardship. The settlement flourished because compassion became more valuable than coin, and every success quietly honored the dreams she and Lucien had once imagined together beside the palace fireplace. Far from Havenbrook, Captain Rowan finally succeeded in freeing Lucien from the prison where he had endured years of confinement. The escape required patience rather than violence, relying on loyal friends who still believed the Iron Duke innocent. Rowan urged him to reclaim his title, gather allies, and challenge those who had stolen his honor, but Lucien refused every suggestion. Revenge no longer mattered. Power held no appeal. He wanted only to ensure Elara remained beyond Cedric's reach. Wearing plain clothing and traveling under false names, he followed distant reports until he reached the hillside overlooking Havenbrook. Hidden among ancient pines, he watched children playing safely in the sunlight and recognized the impossible truth. Despite everything she had suffered, Elara had transformed heartbreak into hope for countless strangers. Pride filled him more deeply than any victory he had won on the battlefield. His quiet vigil soon proved necessary. One evening several hired killers crept toward the bakery after sunset, intending to burn the village and silence the woman whose growing influence threatened Cedric's hidden ambitions. As one assassin raised a flaming torch, an arrow flew from the darkness and struck the weapon from his hand. Before the attackers understood what had happened, more arrows forced them into retreat. They fled into the forest believing an unseen company of archers guarded the settlement, never realizing a single determined man had driven them away. Lucien disappeared before anyone reached the road, leaving only confusion behind. Danger returned weeks later when lightning ignited the roof of the orphanage during a violent storm. Flames spread with terrifying speed while frightened children cried for help from the upper floor. Villagers formed desperate lines carrying buckets from the nearby well, but smoke blocked every staircase. A cloaked stranger suddenly burst through the burning entrance without hesitation. One by one he carried the trapped children outside, shielding them from falling beams until every life had been saved. Before grateful witnesses could thank their rescuer, he vanished into the rain as silently as he had appeared. Elara searched the crowd, certain she had glimpsed familiar determination beneath the soot, yet the mysterious guardian had already disappeared. The final attack came during autumn when masked bandits ambushed Elara's wagon as she returned from delivering medicine to neighboring farms. Outnumbered and unable to escape, she stood protectively before Oliver while the robbers demanded every supply she carried. Steel flashed through the trees before fear could overwhelm her. The cloaked stranger fought with disciplined precision, disarming one attacker after another until the survivors fled into the woods. During the struggle, Elara struck her head against the overturned wagon and lost consciousness. When she awoke beside the riverbank, Oliver was safe, the bandits were gone, and a dark cloak rested gently across her shoulders. She held the unfamiliar fabric close, wondering why an invisible protector risked everything yet refused to reveal his face, unaware that the answer waited only beyond the approaching shadows of war ahead. Autumn's peaceful harvest ended in smoke. Before dawn one cold morning, riders carrying the banners of royal inspectors surrounded Havenbrook while frightened villagers watched from their doorways. Their leader announced that the settlement had been declared a refuge for enemies of the crown and ordered every building searched. Elara stepped forward, calmly demanding proof, but the answer came as flaming arrows arched through the sky and buried themselves in the orphanage roof. Fire raced across the dry timbers, filling the air with screams. Soldiers loyal to Lord Cedric Blackwell dragged villagers into the square, accusing them of treason for accepting strangers without permission. Martha was struck to the ground when she tried to shield several frightened children, and Oliver disappeared amid the confusion as masked men carried him toward waiting horses. Elara struggled desperately against the soldiers restraining her, but the flames, the shouting, and the panic swallowed every desperate cry she made. Hidden beyond the burning fields, Lucien watched the attack begin and understood that years of concealment had finally ended. Cedric no longer feared exposing his conspiracy because he believed every remaining obstacle stood inside the village before him. Lucien removed the weathered cloak that had concealed his identity and fastened the sword he had once carried as the Iron Duke. Captain Rowan emerged from the nearby forest with loyal riders who had quietly gathered over recent months, waiting only for Lucien's command. No speeches were necessary. Every soldier understood what was at stake. Together they charged toward Havenbrook before another innocent life could be stolen. The battle erupted with astonishing speed. Rowan's cavalry crashed through the enemy lines, scattering archers before they could ignite more homes. Lucien rode directly toward the orphanage, where collapsing beams trapped several children inside. Ignoring the heat surrounding the entrance, he forced open the weakened doors and carried the youngest children outside before returning again and again until every room stood empty. Villagers formed lines to extinguish the flames while Martha, bruised but determined, seized a fallen guard's wooden staff and struck another captor hard enough to free several imprisoned women. Fear gradually gave way to courage as ordinary people realized they no longer faced the attackers alone. Meanwhile, Cedric's men transported Oliver to an abandoned cathedral overlooking the capital, believing the child would force Elara into surrender. Celine Varick waited there beside Cedric with quiet satisfaction, convinced that Lucien would finally reveal himself if the boy's life hung in danger. Their confidence proved correct. Guided by scouts, Lucien followed the kidnappers into the ancient building while Rowan led the remaining cavalry toward the city gates to prevent reinforcements from reaching the conspirators. Elara refused to remain behind despite her exhaustion. Armed with nothing more than determination, she joined the villagers pursuing the captors, unwilling to lose another person she loved. Inside the cathedral, shattered stained glass windows cast crimson light across cracked stone floors. Cedric stood beside Oliver with a drawn sword, mocking Lucien for sacrificing his reputation only to lose everything anyway. Selene admitted she had despised Elara from the moment an orphan entered noble society with greater grace than anyone born to privilege. She confessed that poisoning the king had been easier than expected because ambition blinded those closest to the throne. Cedric proudly revealed forged documents, bribed witnesses, and fabricated evidence proving that every accusation against Lucien had been carefully manufactured. Their conspiracy had relied upon one simple truth: honorable people were always easier to deceive than ruthless ones. Steel rang through the cathedral as Lucien advanced. The duel between him and Cedric echoed beneath the ancient arches, each strike fueled by years of injustice. Outside, Rowan's riders defeated the remaining conspirators attempting to reach the cathedral, while Elara and the villagers freed prisoners locked beneath the building. Martha discovered Oliver tied inside a storage chamber and embraced him with trembling relief before carrying him toward safety. When Cedric attempted to seize Elara as a shield, Lucien disarmed him with one decisive movement, sending his sword sliding across the floor. Cornered and defeated, Cedric shouted that none of it would matter because the kingdom already believed Lucien had willingly abandoned his wife. The surviving royal judges arrived shortly afterward with loyal soldiers who had finally uncovered evidence of the conspiracy. They ordered Selene and Cedric placed in chains before turning toward Lucien with solemn expressions. One elderly judge asked the question every witness longed to hear answered. Why had the Iron Duke publicly destroyed the woman he claimed to cherish? Lucien reached inside his worn coat and withdrew a sealed packet protected through years of imprisonment. He handed it to the judges before speaking quietly. He explained that Cedric had threatened Elara's life through hidden assassins waiting across the kingdom. Every cruel word spoken during the trial had been chosen to convince those killers she no longer mattered to him. The documents proved he had transferred every estate, title, and possession into Elara's name before expecting execution, ensuring she would inherit everything if the truth ever emerged. Silence settled over the cathedral as the judges read farewell letters written years earlier, each declaring unwavering love disguised beneath deliberate betrayal. Tears filled Elara's eyes as the impossible truth finally shattered the hatred she had carried for so long, yet forgiveness remained painfully beyond her reach, and the future of their broken hearts waited uncertainly beyond the dawn. The kingdom celebrated the fall of the conspirators with ringing bells and overflowing streets, yet Lucien found no joy in the cheers that followed his name. The judges restored every title, every estate, and every honor that had been stolen from him, but he accepted them without pride. He knew justice had repaired his reputation while leaving Elara's heart scarred by years of loneliness. When officials invited him to serve as regent until the crown stabilized, he declined with quiet gratitude. Power had once defined his public life, yet sacrifice had taught him that authority meant little beside the trust of one wounded soul. Rather than returning to the palace, he traveled back to Havenbrook and joined the villagers rebuilding homes destroyed during Cedric's attack. He worked from sunrise until darkness settled across the valley, carrying heavy stones beside farmers, repairing roofs with carpenters, planting fruit trees with children, and helping blacksmiths forge new tools. Few newcomers recognized the man who had once commanded armies because he wore ordinary clothing stained with dust and sweat. Whenever grateful villagers praised his efforts, he answered that rebuilding together mattered more than remembering old titles. Rowan remained nearby, watching with quiet satisfaction as the commander he had admired chose humility over glory. Martha smiled whenever she caught Lucien sweeping floors in the orphanage or mending broken chairs without being asked. Every simple task became another silent apology offered to the woman whose suffering he could never erase. Elara observed these changes from a respectful distance. She no longer doubted Lucien's love, yet understanding the truth did not instantly heal the wounds left by his silence. She remembered cold nights spent believing herself abandoned, the insults hurled by strangers, and the countless tears shed after hearing the words that had destroyed her world. Those memories could not disappear merely because they had been spoken for noble reasons. Still, she also remembered the mysterious guardian who had saved Havenbrook again and again, realizing every rescue had been another expression of the love he could never safely confess. Her heart stood between gratitude and grief, uncertain whether forgiveness required forgetting or simply choosing hope despite lingering pain. Weeks became months as life slowly returned to normal. The bakery filled each morning with the scent of fresh bread, children once again filled the school with laughter, and gardens bloomed where ashes had covered the ground. Oliver followed Lucien everywhere, asking endless questions about horses, swords, and stars until the former duke laughed more often than he had in years. Watching them together stirred something gentle inside Elara because she saw not the feared Iron Duke but a patient man teaching a curious child with kindness instead of authority. She began joining Lucien during village projects, speaking politely though cautiously, allowing trust to grow one conversation at a time rather than expecting broken hearts to heal overnight. When spring returned, Elara walked alone toward the ancient oak where she and Lucien had first spoken years before. Birds sang among fresh green branches while warm sunlight filtered through the leaves, making the quiet hillside feel untouched by sorrow. Lucien stood beneath the tree exactly as he had promised Martha he would every morning, never knowing whether Elara might come. She approached slowly, holding something small within her closed hand. Without speaking, she opened her fingers to reveal the wedding ring he had thrown onto the courtroom floor so many years earlier. Martha had secretly retrieved it after the trial and preserved it until the truth emerged. Tears glistened in Elara's eyes as she whispered, "This time, don't ever let it fall." Lucien accepted the ring with trembling hands, slid it gently onto her finger once more, and embraced her without another word because no apology could equal the promise carried within that quiet moment. Their happiness, however, was not the kingdom's final surprise. While restoring records hidden by Cedric, royal scholars uncovered documents concerning Oliver's birth. An unusual mark upon the boy's shoulder matched descriptions recorded for the infant grandson of the late king, who had vanished during the chaos surrounding the poisoning. Witnesses confirmed that loyal servants had hidden the child before being captured, hoping someone compassionate would eventually protect him. The abandoned baby Elara had rescued outside the church was, in truth, the rightful heir to the throne. Nobles immediately urged Lucien and Elara to rule in the child's place, arguing that no one else possessed greater wisdom or public devotion. Together they refused. They accepted responsibility only as Oliver's guardians until he reached adulthood, believing the kingdom deserved its lawful sovereign rather than ambitious substitutes. Years passed beneath peaceful skies shaped by that decision. Hospitals, schools, orphanages, libraries, and homes for veterans spread across the realm using the restored Ashcroft fortune, while Havenbrook became a model for every province seeking unity through compassion. When Oliver finally ascended the throne, he addressed a grateful kingdom with steady confidence. He declared that history often celebrated conquerors, but his greatest teachers had conquered bitterness instead of nations. The crowd turned toward Lucien and Elara, now older yet still walking hand in hand, their joined fingers bound by the same ring once abandoned upon a courtroom floor. As bells echoed across the kingdom, they smiled at the flourishing lives surrounding them, knowing love had been earned twice, kindness had outlived cruelty, and hope would remain their greatest inheritance forever.